I used to think silence was something you earned like stillness after a storm. But some silences arrive without warning, and they feel like the kind that never asked for your consent. The article appeared while I was waiting in line at the post office, buried between headlines about quarterly markets and a real estate developer's scandal, the Whitmore legacy, father-son, and the quiet continuity of power. The photo showed Logan standing beside my father, both in dark suits, identical tilt to the chin. My mother sat in the center, a white-gloved hand resting on Logan's wrist, like a claim. I reread the caption, "The only heir to the Whitmore Foundation prepares to take his place as sole beneficiary." The phrasing wasn't ambiguous, it was precise, and the word soul hung in my throat longer than I expected. I opened the family group portal, the one we called Legacy Circle, though I hadn't visited it in months. The login screen greeted me with a new message, access restricted. Administrator has changed credentials. I tried once more, slower. Same result. My last message sat in my sent folder unread. A PDF of Grandpa Elias's medical bill with a note beneath it. I've paid this one. Let me know if any follow-up paperwork is needed. No replies, no reaction. Just one quiet heart emoji. From myself, weeks ago. That night, a message came from Grace. She wasn't close, not exactly, but she was the kind of cousin who still remembered birthdays, soft-voiced, gentle in the way people are when they've lived too close to fire. Erin, don't come. They've decided not to include you. I thought you should know before you hear it somewhere worse. No punctuation, just line breaks. I sat for a while before opening the trust ledger. It wasn't curiosity. It was routine, the way you check an old scar without knowing why. My name used to appear on page 3 under contingent beneficiaries. There had been a clause once written in careful legal neutrality, should either child express disinterest or incapacity. Now only one name remained, Logan Charles Whitmore. Amended 3 months ago. No notice, no explanation, no request for consent. The next morning, an envelope arrived bearing the seal of Whitmore Legal Affairs. I recognized the ivory stalk immediately. Inside, one single sheet. A memo, unsigned, unaddressed. Please update formal language for all media materials. The Whitmores have one child. Please revise accordingly. No name. Not mine. Not anyone's. Later that afternoon, I received a voicemail. My mother never leaves voicemails. This time she did. You haven't been forgotten. There's simply no role for you in this particular announcement. Try not to misread that. The inflection on announcement made it sound like a press release, not a family decision. I didn't call back. I didn't delete the message either. I just listened to it again, slowly, and then once more without the sound on. There had been a cardigan in the attic with my initials stitched into the tag, EMU. My grandmother's hands had sewn it tight, looped thread the color of dusk. I found it last spring when clearing the last boxes. It smelled of cedar and something older than fabric. I'd meant to take it with me. I left it instead, folded at the top of a shelf no one opens. My father's secretary sent me a document a few weeks ago to sign a harmless update to streamline internal structures. I didn't sign it. I didn't return it. But I read every word. Page 7 contained a revision of the governance clause. In the event that any party poses reputational instability, said a party's access to holdings or statements may be restricted without formal hearing. No one had used the word instability with me, not out loud, but they didn't need to. I urged my own name online. One photo remained a blurry group shot from a gala 4 years ago. I was in the far left of the frame, half obscured by a centerpiece. The caption named every other person in the image. My absence had become institutional. That's the thing about being erased. Slowly you begin to cooperate with it, one unchecked box at a time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel heat or cold or the sudden rush people like to describe. I sat still. The table was clean, except for a ring of tea I hadn't wiped up from this morning. The shape reminded me of the old family crest, a circle within a circle, lined with lines that didn't connect. A crow passed by the window, not flying, just walking, deliberate in its movement across the frost-dusted porch railing. It paused once looked in, and moved on. The sun faded behind the slope. I didn't turn on the lights. No one had told me not to come, but someone had made sure I wouldn't think to. And that I realized was quieter than a door closing. It was the sound of no one expecting you. I used to believe that if I stayed small enough, quiet enough, careful enough, I might fit. When college applications were due, I submitted mine 2 days early, all business majors. One of the advisors pulled me aside after class, his voice low. Your scores suggest physics or systems engineering. Are you sure this is what you want? I thanked him for the suggestion, then filed it away like a receipt I wasn't allowed to use. My mother had already circled the university brochure in red pen administration track. Practical, presentable. At the end of summer dinner, my father passed the peas without glancing up. You'll need to be sharper this time. Last year you came off soft in the interview. I nodded. No one noticed I hadn't spoken all evening. Or maybe they had and preferred it that way. I never missed a holiday. I booked the earliest flights, wrapped gifts with cloth ribbon instead of the peel and stick kind. One year I arrived with a scarf I'd woven over the fall, a small, lopsided thing in slate grey. I left it folded neatly on my mother's chair. This must have taken time, she said, lifting one end. Then she turned to Logan. You're right. Red does wash me out. Good eye. My birthday fell 3 days after his. I always mailed his card first. Once I slipped a signed book into the envelope, something about design theory I thought he'd like. There was no reply. At Christmas, I found the book in the hallway donation bin untouched. When the foundation expanded its overseas branches, I offered to transfer quietly without asking. They said they appreciated the flexibility. Weeks later, a message arrived on my phone. Thanks for not complicating things. That was the full sentence. No salutation. No punctuation. I used to believe that was gratitude. I repeated it in my head on days when the power would cut in the satellite office or when a package from home didn't arrive. I read it like a coded compliment, the kind you had to work to earn. I'd never told them about the years after that. The clearance levels the languages learned, the nights spent on concrete roofs, translating intercepted signals with freezing fingers. It wasn't shame. It wasn't secrecy. I just assumed it wouldn't matter. Not the way Logan's promotion or Clara's award for philanthropic leadership did. There was a dinner the year Logan made partner. I flew in that morning, changed clothes in the airport bathroom, and arrived exactly on time. The place cards were arranged in 3 tight circles. Mine wasn't among them. I stood for a moment near the coats. My father walked by and placed a hand on my shoulder without turning. You clean up well. Let's not make this about you tonight. Later, while waiting for a cab, Clara handed me a napkin with half a cupcake folded inside. Someone forgot to bring a proper gift. This will have to do. She smiled, the kind of smile that photographs well. I kept the napkin in my coat pocket until spring. By then it had unraveled into layers of paper lace, the frosting pressed into faint red smudges. It felt wrong to throw it away, but wrong to keep it too. I once bought a small framed print to hang in the entryway of their house. A minimalist piece, a single tree standing alone in white snow. I thought it was quite elegant. When I returned the next year, it was gone. We needed the wall space for Logan's award, my mother said, already walking into the kitchen. I learned not to linger, not to expect, not to ask. When an extended cousin invited me to speak on a local panel about women in security, I asked my parents if they'd prefer I pass. Clara's response came the next morning. It's your name, technically. Just be mindful who you align it with. That word, technically, became a kind of echo I carried. Not rejection, just erosion. I used to practice things I might say if anyone asked how I was doing. I rehearsed answers that weren't too proud, too specific, too threatening to the symmetry of the family's surface. But no one ever asked, and I got good at not minding. Once, on a rare visit home, I noticed a drawer in the foyer desk had been relabeled Important Papers. Inside were warranties, insurance policies, deeds. The envelope with my name was no longer there. In its place, inactive, archived off-site. I didn't ask where off-site was. I ironed my blouse for dinner that night. I combed my hair straight, the way Clara preferred, tucked behind both ears. During dessert, she reached for the silver tray and looked across the table. You always were good at not drawing attention to yourself. That's a gift most people ruin by trying to prove they have it. I folded the napkin in half, then in half again. The tablecloth had a faint stain shaped like a map. No one else noticed. Or maybe they did and chose not to speak. That was the thing I didn't want to be right. I only ever wanted to belong in the quiet. But sometimes the quiet doesn't mean you're welcome. Sometimes it just means you've learned not to speak. I remember things by where they were placed, not what was said. The trophy had a weight I didn't expect. I carried it with both hands, all the way from the school auditorium to the house, fingers still smelling faintly of solder. The metal was warm when I set it down, like it had absorbed every sleepless night I'd spent building the arm, every burn, every grease smear. I stood in the foyer longer than I meant to, just holding it, waiting for a voice that never came. My mother looked over from the hall. You should wash your hands. That oil leaves marks on the carpet. I rinsed them under cold water until they felt clean enough to be invisible. The trophy ended up in the library. Not on the mantel, not on the long display shelf near the piano. It was slid behind a stack of leather-bound volumes, European Military History, 1860 to 1945. When I went to look for it months later, it was still there, the brass slightly dulled. Dust had settled into the engraved letters, softening even the proof that it had once mattered. That same week, Logan got accepted onto the Academy's junior team. There was a party at the club, white linen, string lights, too much shrimp. I wasn't invited to speak. I sat near the window and drank ginger ale from a short glass, pretending it had something stronger in it. A woman I didn't know leaned over and smiled. You must be Logan's cousin. You've got that quiet look. I nodded. The next Christmas, I carved a photo frame from leftover wood in the workshop. I'd found a picture of my mother as a girl sitting with Grandma Rose on the porch steps, both wearing matching aprons. I had it printed in black and white, slightly grainy, the way old memories look softer when they're blurred. I wrapped it in brown paper and string. She opened other gifts first, a silk scarf from Logan, a crystal dish from someone at the foundation, a pair of gloves she never wore. My package sat untouched beneath her chair. Later, I saw the frame on the hallway console, but the photo had changed. Logan and my father shaking hands after a board meeting. The back of the frame still had my initials carved in, a little uneven. I never mentioned it. There was a dinner the night I got the offer from the department. I forwarded the email while I waited at the airport. No reply, so I called. "It's a position overseas," I explained. There was a pause. Then, "So you're leaving again? When will this constant uprooting stop?" I never knew how to answer questions that sounded like conclusions. At 16, I gave a short speech at a regional science conference. The panel thanked me quietly, and one woman asked afterward if my family was attending the evening session. I told her they had another obligation. That wasn't untrue. Logan had a semifinals match that afternoon. Back home, I left the conference folder on the dining room table. It was gone the next morning. No one mentioned it. When my uncle passed, I flew in overnight to be at the service. I wore a simple black dress, and the bracelet Clara had once given me, a thin silver chain with a small oval charm. The clasp stuck. I struggled with it in the car until it pinched my skin. She greeted me at the church steps. "You made it. Be discreet, please. It's a family moment." During the reception, Logan raised a toast to those who always show up when it counts. The room clinked glasses. I folded a napkin into a small square and watched the condensation trail down the side of my cup. I remember once asking my father if I should join a committee. Any committee, just to stay involved. "You're better behind the curtain," he said, buttering a roll. "Some people belong in the front row. Some are structural." I nodded. That was the year I stopped submitting updates. There was a drawer in the office labeled Erin, temporary. It contained a few reports I'd written a letter of commendation, and an old employee badge with the corner chipped off. I found it open one evening. The drawer had been relabeled Storage, no subheading. One summer while reorganizing the garage, I came across a box marked Miscellaneous. Inside was the apron I used to wear for science fairs, the one Clara had sewn when I was 12. Pale green stitched with my initials in thread, slightly too dark. I held it up against myself, still fit. Still smelled faintly of wood polish and graphite. I left it there. Sometimes I wonder what my voice sounded like to them, whether it registered at all or if it was simply background noise that softened the edges of their certainty. Logan once told a journalist he came from a family that valued presence over performance. I clipped the article. Not out of spite, just habit. I folded it and slipped it into the back of an old notebook where I kept things people said that didn't quite fit. I don't resent the forgetting. That would suggest I expected to be remembered. I only ever wanted to be somewhere someone noticed the weight of what I carried before I put it down. I used to think names were permanent, inked into things that didn't move. The magazine arrived folded the way news finds its way into hands that didn't ask for it. A friend had circled the headline in blue pen, the kind used by teachers and accountants. 3 pillars of the Whitmore dynasty, Henry, Clara, and their son, Logan. The photo was recent. They stood in front of the main estate, the house where I learned to spell my last name in cursive. My mother's posture was flawless, one hand resting on Logan's shoulder like a page marker. My father stood with both hands clasped the way he did when he wanted to appear thoughtful but controlled. The caption listed their names in bold, followed by legacy secured. The future uninterrupted. Inside a quote in italics, "We have one child, and a legacy is too important to dilute with distraction." No signatures, just attribution. Clara Whitmore, co-founder, the Whitmore Foundation. I read it 3 times, not for clarity, but to watch the words dull into familiarity. Later that afternoon, I checked the property records. The cabin's small pine framed a place my grandfather once called your corner of the quiet world had shifted titles. No sale, no dispute, just realignment. The new listing placed it under the Whitmore Family Conservation Trust, overseen by the Foundation Board, chaired by Clara. The file described it as Ancestral Holdings Consolidated for Environmental Stewardship. My name did not appear, not even in the history. I found the original deed tucked in a folder beneath a stack of older tax documents. My initials had been carefully typed beside the property line description, Erin M. Whitmore recipient, non-transferable for private residence or study. There was even a paperclip rust mark from where I'd once attached a thank you note. That version no longer existed online. I forwarded the change to the firm that had handled the trust years ago. The email bounced back instantly. A brief red banner blinked across the top of the screen. Sender is not authorized to initiate legal queries related to Whitmore family assets. There was no point in calling. I knew the tone I'd hear. Measured, rehearsed, unbothered. At dinner, I used the last of the pasta and sat alone with a glass of water. The table still had a faint circle where a candle once scorched the finish. I ran my thumb over it, out of habit. That was when I noticed the envelope. No return address, no handwriting. Just a windowed label printed in a serif font I didn't recognize. The letter inside wasn't addressed to me. It read, "To whom it may concern, this individual is no longer affiliated with the Whitmore Foundation. Any statements made on behalf of the family should be disregarded as personal opinion and do not reflect the values or history of the organization." It wasn't signed. I turned it over, half expecting a mistake. A second page, a slip, a note from someone in administration explaining it had been mailed in error. But there was nothing, not even a date. I let the letter rest beside the chipped plate. For a moment, I imagined a boardroom where someone read it aloud, not as cruelty, but as clarity. No raised voices, just a quiet line drawn where I had once stood. Some people vanish from photographs, others are written out before the camera flashes. There was a sweater in the hall closet at the estate. Dusty green hand-stitched my name embroidered faintly inside the collar. It had been there since I was 17, hung on a hook just beneath the utility shelf. I hadn't seen it during my last visit. I asked the housekeeper once without much weight. It must have been cleared out with the old things. No follow-up, no explanation. Just one more object that had failed to insist on its place. When I updated my bank information that month, a note appeared during login account verification, incomplete. Legal verification of familial link pending. I called the helpline. The voice on the other end was kind, uncertain. There seems to be a mismatch in the beneficiary record. Are you sure you're listed under the family account? I didn't answer. There was a time when I would have called Clara, asked quietly if a mistake had been made, framed it as a systems error, phrased it with the soft ends of a sentence so she could fill the rest. But I knew how it would go. You always wanted independence, Erin. I thought we were respecting that. The word respecting would land like a compliment while removing the flaw beneath it. I used to keep a photograph on my desk, a black and white shot of the family, standing beneath a sycamore tree, our faces half in shadow. The frame broke during a move. I never replaced the glass. Instead, I tucked it behind a book on signal decryption, where it stayed flat and quiet. Names fade differently depending on who holds the pen. Sometimes they're erased with urgency. Other times, they're overwritten gently, officially, legally. I left the envelope unopened after that first reading. There was no need to revisit what had already been removed. Some things don't need to be said twice to disappear completely. Silence isn't something that descends, it's something you step into. The apartment held echoes more than objects. I moved through it without urgency, folding things into shapes that no longer belonged to a life in motion. The cardigan with the worn cuffs went first, then the passport I hadn't renewed, then a mug with a chip too small to justify throwing away, but too sharp to forget. I wrapped it in a dish towel anyway. No one had called, not since the letter, not since the photograph, not since the slow erasure became complete. I opened my laptop one last time. The screen still lit up with the image of a blue-grey sky I'd taken near the coast back when I thought quiet places healed better than loud ones. The icon for the family shared drive blinked in the corner. I right-clicked. Remove access. An email window was already open, addressed to Clara's assistant, still auto-filled from some long-ago introduction at a gala. Please remove my contact from all internal distribution. No greeting, no closing, just instruction. I hovered over the send button longer than necessary, then clicked. The screen went blank. One drawer held a copy of the trust agreement corners bent highlights from a different year. I didn't shred it. I placed it under a stack of outdated manuals and let it disappear by weight. Social media came next. Profiles unlinked. Accounts disabled, follows removed. Each click felt like undoing stitches on clothing that no longer fit. Logan's page had a new banner, him in a navy suit shaking hands with someone who once shook mine. The caption read, "Vision, Legacy, Unity." I didn't screenshot it. I just closed the tab and moved on. There was one bag canvas frayed at the edges with a stitched tag from a base I no longer spoke of. I packed lightly clothes for layering a sealed envelope, a flash drive, and a letter I hadn't finished reading. It was the only thing with handwriting left in my possession. My grandfather's hand curved slightly to the right, every T crossed with discipline. He'd written it the summer before the diagnosis, when his voice still held timber and his grip could crack walnuts. I'd opened it once. The words stopped halfway down the page. If you're reading this, I want you to remember. And then I folded it back. I wasn't ready then. I wasn't sure if I was now. I tucked it into the inner pocket of the bag between the passport and a worn field notebook that still smelled faintly of graphite and sweat. I didn't write a letter of goodbye. Not to Clara, not to Henry, not to Logan. Instead, I returned the keys. I stood outside the brownstone where I used to spend weekends after grad school, the one they called a temporary gift when the paperwork was first drawn. The mailbox still bore the brass plate, Whitmore, guest residence. I slid the envelope into the slot without hesitating. Inside 2 silver keys, the stamped property tax receipt marked paid in full, and nothing else. No message, no post-it, no signature. There are goodbyes that come in words. Mine came in receipts. I booked the bus online. No one knew the route, not even the driver probably. It stopped through cities that didn't need to be named and landscapes that didn't ask questions. The seat beside me stayed empty. A man across the aisle glanced once, then not again. I stared at the back of the headrest and thought about how quiet things end, not with ceremony, not with fire, but with a soft closing of tabs, drawers, folders, doors. At the first rest stop, I stretched my legs, not because I needed to, but because routine felt safer than reflection. Inside the convenience store, I bought a pen, a cheap one. Blue ink. I didn't need it. I just didn't want to leave with empty hands. There was a phrase someone once used to describe me whispered at a table I wasn't meant to overhear. She doesn't cause trouble. She just disappears when it gets inconvenient. The woman who said it wore pearls so tight they left imprints on her skin. I let that line sit in my mouth like an unchewed seed. Disappearing wasn't the hard part. It was knowing that no one would chase after you. At the next station, I switched my phone to airplane mode, even though we were still on the ground. One last message buzzed through before the signal dropped. "We're restructuring the board. Please confirm you've received the NDA." I didn't respond. The envelope with my grandfather's handwriting shifted slightly in my bag as the bus took a turn. I touched it through the canvas just once to remind myself it was still there. Not everything gets erased. Some things are left behind intentionally. Some days don't begin. They just continue in a different room. The floor creaked under my heel, not from wear, but from memory. The cabin held other lives before mine, boots lined at the door, maps folded imperfectly, coffee stains etched into grain. I didn't rearrange anything. I swept the dust to the corners and left it there. Each morning I filled the kettle with water. I filtered myself and set it on the wood stove. I liked the way the metal sang just before it boiled. A low warning, never urgent. The enamel teapot had a chipped handle, and the crack along its side had been mended with solder, clumsy but functional. When I poured, I always steadied it with both hands. I didn't check the news. I didn't check my phone. The signal here was weak, but that wasn't the reason. A small radio sat on the counter, still tuned to the public station my friend once liked. I turned the dial to off. Silence when chosen tastes different than when imposed. On the third morning, a package arrived. No name on the return label, just a paperback water-warped with a note inside. "You always read the end first. Try not to this time." The handwriting wasn't familiar, but the thought was. I didn't finish the book. I left it on the windowsill where the sunlight curled its pages slowly forward. I spent afternoons writing not strategy memos or summaries for clearance, just sentences that didn't need to be right. Today I wrote, "There's no punishment in absence unless you keep explaining it." Another time I used to think quiet meant failure. Most pages I didn't reread. The journal had belonged to someone else too. A name scribbled in the front, scratched out with a thick black pen, still faintly visible underneath. I never asked. The chair I used creaked more than the floorboards. I let it. Some things were allowed to protest quietly. Nights came earlier here. The snow didn't fall hard but steadily, as if time decided to settle gently on the world. I kept a single oil lamp, lit not for vision, but for proof. The flame cast a soft arc on the ceiling beams, making the wood look like it breathed. Dinner was whatever fit in one pot. Nothing needed garnish. I ate slowly, not because I savored, but because I could. One evening I found a coat in the closet, olive drab too big at the shoulders, pockets worn thin. I slipped my hands inside and felt a folded receipt for a bus ticket dated 5 years ago. One way. No city listed. I didn't unfold it. I just put the coat back and closed the door without sound. There were no visitors. Once a squirrel scratched at the back window. Another time a bird tapped its beak against the glass as if asking to be remembered. I didn't name them. Naming things invites memory. I had enough of that. I woke once to the sound of snow slipping off the roof, landing in a soft thud that shook nothing but air. I stayed in bed. The blanket was heavy enough to press against bone, and I didn't mind. Some nights I thought I heard footsteps from the woods, not threatening, just misplaced. I didn't go to the window. Not everything unknown requires attention. I wrote again. Being missed is different from being found. One morning, a letter arrived, addressed only to current occupants. Inside, a pre-approved credit offer expired. I used it to start the kindling. There was a calendar nailed to the pantry door. Last year's. February, circled twice. No other marks. I left it as it was. I answered no messages. A voicemail had appeared when I briefly turned my phone on to check the time. Just wanted to know if you'll be attending the memorial this year. No name, no callback request. I deleted it without listening again. Later, I peeled the label from a tin can too neatly, the glue still clinging to my fingers. I rolled it into a ball and placed it in the fire, watching it wrinkle into silence. The letter from my grandfather stayed in my bag. I moved it once to a drawer beside the kettle, but didn't open it. I wasn't waiting. I just hadn't decided what to carry forward. There was a single nail above the desk. No picture, just a faint rectangle of cleaner wood around it. Whatever had been there was long gone. The absence framed itself. Some evenings I lit a candle and sat by the window. I didn't expect anything outside, and that made it easier to stay. In the margins of the journal, I wrote, "No one knows where I am." For the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. Not to them, not to me. Some returns are just rehearsals for appearances. The subject line read, "Archival Request, Whitmore Family Exhibit." I let it sit unopened for a day, though the preview alone gave enough away. The body was short, punctuated polite. "We are preparing a visual retrospective for the upcoming The Legacy Benefit Gala. Kindly send any childhood photographs from Camp Whitmore, summer 2005. Best Abigail Farley, Executive Assistant to Mrs. Clara Whitmore." There was no greeting, no "Dear Erin," no question of how I'd been, or even confirmation that the address still belonged to me. I didn't reply. 3 days later, a voicemail blinked on the screen. A man's voice clipped and cautious. "This is Joshua Martin, legal representative for the Whitmore estate. We are restructuring family holdings to ensure uninterrupted succession. Please review and sign the enclosed waiver formally relinquishing any residual claims. No action required beyond signature." Thank you. There was no mention of which property, no recognition that any of it had once been mine or touched by my hand. The document came in a cream envelope, heavy with embossed gold lettering, the kind used for weddings and final judgments. Inside the waiver, simple language, deceptively so. The undersigned acknowledges no further entitlement, moral or legal, to the Whitmore Foundation's assets, affiliations, or historic representation. I folded it back into the envelope, left it beside the chipped teapot. Outside, snow had crusted into the corners of the windows. I watched a bird hop between the fence posts, never flying, just testing weight, as if unsure which direction meant trust. Later that evening, I opened my laptop to check the weather and saw the notification Logan had posted something public. A photo, him arm slung around our father, both in matching windbreakers, standing before the new foundation center. Clara in the background, one hand on the dedication plaque. The caption read, "Family is everything. Sometimes you have to choose what's truly worth preserving." Hashtags beneath #Whitmore, strong hand legacy, matters, built. On honor, there were over 2,000 likes, comments glowing with admiration. What a blessing. A real American dynasty. Such a powerful mother-son bond. I scrolled down, searched for my name. Nothing. No mention that the original architectural plans were drawn from my old sketches. No acknowledgement of who first filed the permit application 10 years ago. No trace. A few days passed, another email arrived. No subject line this time, just a one-sentence message. Let us know if you'd like to be listed as early contributor, in absentia. I didn't answer. The phrase echoed later when I swept ashes from the fireplace. In absentia, as if presence was a clerical detail, a variable on a spreadsheet, a placeholder for legal neatness. I looked at the receipt I'd used as a bookmark, a coffee bill from a roadside diner in Montpellier. I hadn't remembered keeping it. The ink had faded, but the tip line was circled. I'd written, "Leave it open." The journal stayed mostly shut that week. Not because I had nothing to say, because I didn't want to answer myself. I reread the waiver, not for meaning but for pattern. The lines were precise, sterile. They had paid good money to make forgetting seem civilized. No mention of the cedar box I'd stained by hand for Mother's birthday. No acknowledgement of the calluses I earned helping restore the old greenhouse. No line item for time. Another message came this time from a third-party PR firm. The email signature had a sparkle effect. "We're curating a timeline for the Whitmore brand story. Optional video interviews available for former associates. We can film remotely. Would you prefer a nature backdrop or rustic cabin theme?" The irony almost made me laugh. I closed the laptop instead. At the bottom of my trunk was a scarf, frayed at the ends, stitched once by my grandmother's hands. She had passed it to me in a brown envelope, whispering, "This never belonged to them." I wrapped it around a bundle of dry kindling, not as firewood, just as reminder. I walked to the mailbox that afternoon, not to send anything, but to make sure it still opened. The flag was stiff with ice. A neighbor had left a note. "Heard, a plow might come up next week. Let me know if you want your path cleared." I turned it over. Wrote nothing. Inside the teacup I used most had started to develop a fine crack along the rim. I turned it, each time I drank, avoiding the split. Not to ignore it, just to choose where to place my mouth. I wrote again in the margin of the journal, "They want the shape, not the shadow, the headline, not the handprint." Then underneath in smaller ink, "I am not absence. I am refusal." And I left the page open. Just one. Some changes aren't announced. They settle in quietly like furniture rearranged during sleep. The cat showed up 3 mornings in a row before I left out the chipped bowl. I didn't name her right away. She earned it later scout when I saw how she moved like someone who didn't need anyone to follow her, but tolerated the idea of being watched. I kept the bowl outside. She never came indoors, but sat by the porch railing as if keeping an unspoken agreement. We didn't owe each other anything, and somehow that made it easier to trust. My laptop stayed on the corner table, angled slightly toward the window. I worked in small blocks of time, translating encrypted datasets for a non-profit monitoring cyber threats against public infrastructure. No headlines, no promotions, no team retreats, just clean code and silent approval. The kind of work that rewards precision without demanding personality. I built a bookshelf beside the window. 3 shelves. Stained pine, Emerson Whitman Baldwin. No family portraits, no photo albums. One corner was left for a cloth-bound journal, blank, unlined with the initials E embossed faintly on the cover. The only thing I allowed with my full initials. Inside each page began the same way. Today I was not who they remember. The first entries were just that repetition. Later, they grew longer. Not confessions. not declarations, just small sentences that shaped the edges of the person I was building. I went to the town library on Tuesdays. Quiet place, mostly retirees and kids after school. I signed up to volunteer. When the head librarian asked if I'd teach a class on basic coding, I nodded. No, resume required. The whiteboard in the back room smelled like old marker ink and something vaguely like chalk. The kids were curious, distracted, alive. I didn't tell them anything about where I'd worked. I didn't mention my last name. On the third session, a woman mid-30s, likely a mother or aunt, stayed behind. She watched me erase the board and leaned casually against the doorway. You don't seem like someone who came from one of those powerful families. I capped the marker slowly. I didn't used to know what real power looked like. She didn't ask what I meant. At home, I warmed soup in a dented saucepan. Scout circled the porch once before disappearing into the brush again. On the table, the napkin holder was a bent metal coil I'd found in the shed. It didn't match anything. I kept it anyway. I'd stopped checking the old email accounts. Anything important would find its way through lawyers. Anything personal hadn't been personal in years. In the evenings, I lit a small lamp with a green glass chatard, the kind found in university libraries. I liked the way it glowed softly against the wood. A kind of quiet permanence. I kept the envelope from the waiver, not for sentimental reasons, but as reminder. The gold embossing now had a crease down its middle, folded once with purpose. Once while tidying the bookshelf, I found an old note tucked between pages of Leaves of Grass. It was mine. When the names vanish, what remains must be chosen. I underlined it twice before closing the book. A few of the local teens asked if I could teach them encryption. I said yes, but only if they came every week and stayed off social media during class. One boy grinned. You sound like a spy. I shrugged. Maybe I just like silence. There were no late-night calls from family, no surprise messages, no knock on the door asking me to reconsider. The absence was not sharp anymore. It was symmetrical, like a door perfectly sealed from both sides. I bought a mug at the thrift shop. White ceramic, faint crack along the handle. It reminded me of the one Ada used in the summers. I held it every morning even after the tea cooled. Scout scratched once at the woodpile, but never meowed. I admired that. I taught the kids how to mask strings, how to trace IP shadows, how to read between patterns. I wrote notes in the blank journal like, protection is not silence. It's precision. One morning, someone left a flyer in the mailbox. Legacy Gala, honoring the Whitmore contribution to national security and family heritage. I didn't read further. I folded it and tucked it under the fire starter kindling, not to burn it. Just to place it where it could wait, unchanged. I wore the same navy cardigan most days. One button missing. I hadn't sewn it back. I liked the imperfection. It reminded me I wasn't curated anymore. When someone asked if I was new in town, I smiled once. Not new. Just elsewhere before. I stopped introducing myself with a surname, just Erin, not because I was hiding, because I was finished proving I existed. The journal's last line that week was short. Just 5 words I own the quiet now. And then nothing. No flourish, no signature. Just the weight of choosing stillness and meaning it. Some decisions don't arrive loudly. They sit at your table. Wait for you to notice and leave when they're no longer needed. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. My name was printed in a serif font, too formal to have come from someone who remembered how I held a pen. Miss Erin Whitmore, It read like a name borrowed for ceremony, not truth. The return address was a firm in Connecticut, not a letter from a person, but from a system. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the counter next to the kettle, waited until the water had cooled too much to steep properly, then tore the flap clean across without trying to preserve it. Inside 2 pages. One, a cover letter citing the finalization of estate reconciliations. The second, a waiver. Clean lines, legal formatting. Near the bottom, a line waiting for my signature. The phrasing was deliberate. By signing below the undersigned, relinquishes any present or future claim to assets under the Whitmore estate and affirms no association with the family trust, effective immediately. A line, a name, a space for a date. I stood there with the pen in my hand, not poised, not trembling, just still. The pen was one I'd bought at a second-hand shop. It had a chipped cap and an ink cartridge that skipped if pressed too hard. I liked that. It forced you to write deliberately. I did not sign. Instead, I opened the drawer with the old stationery, thick unbranded off-white. I wrote slowly, carefully, not to be poetic but to be unmistakable. I am no longer someone who appears on asset ledgers. I do not ask to be restored. But I will not erase myself again. I folded the letter in thirds, tucked it into a new envelope with an old photograph I'd found weeks earlier behind a book at the cabin. I must have placed it there during the move. In the photo, I was 10, standing in the snow outside Ada's house. My coat was too big, my gloves mismatched. No one else was in the frame. I was laughing at something unseen. The edges of the photo were slightly warped from time. I didn't write anything on the back. That evening I sat by the window with a cup of water that had once been tea. Scout didn't show. The porch light buzzed faintly. The plaque on the cabin door had always bothered me. Whitmore. Painted in weatherproof black, slightly chipped at the corners. I remembered bringing it with me without thinking, some part of me assuming I'd need to belong to something visible. I unscrewed it slowly. No noise, no announcement. In its place, I nailed a hand-carved piece of wood I'd worked on for weeks. Nothing elaborate. Just a name burned into the grain, E. Langford. The first initial stayed. The last name belonged to someone who had never asked me to explain my usefulness. I didn't tell anyone I made the change. No post, no update. Weeks passed. An email arrived in the inbox I'd checked only for utility bills. The sender was familiar, the same legal assistant who'd mailed the waiver. This time, no attachment. We acknowledge receipt of your letter. The estate file has been noted as closed. No greeting, no closing, just a statement. I didn't reply. Later that week, I received a postcard from an unknown address. No signature. Just a photo of the old Whitmore lake house, its dock still intact. The caption printed at the bottom read, "Legacy isn't always about keeping what was built." I didn't frame it. I didn't tear it, either. I tucked it behind the mirror face down. I made soup, lentils, and thyme. Ate it with the spoon that had a faint dent near the handle. I had no reason to replace it. In town, people called me Erin. Just Erin. Sometimes Miss Langford when they were being polite. No one asked more than once. I started writing code again. Not for clients. For myself. Encryption patterns that held no message, just form. Just silence that shaped itself into logic. I taught one last session at the library. The kids were loud, not cruel. One of them, a girl with short braids and an oversized sweatshirt, looked at me as she packed up. "I like how you never tell us what to be." I nodded. At home, the journal stayed open to a blank page. I didn't write anything that night. There are no conclusions in real life, only decisions made in rooms with no one watching. I lit a candle, not because I needed light, but because I liked the way it flickered without being asked to do more than burn. The old envelope with Miss Erin Whitmore lay beneath a stack of firewood now. Not burned, not displayed, a thing received, and then let go. I kept my eyes on the rim of the cup, tracing the chipped line in its porcelain, as if it held an answer I'd overlooked. The tea had gone cold hours ago, but I never lifted the mug again. I turned it gently in my hands, mapping the fracture where the glaze had split. No point in heating it. The stillness suited the day. Scout padded into the kitchen and sat by the stove waiting for the water to finish its song. The kettle's soft whistle carried through the cabin's empty spaces. I poured a small stream of hot water into a second cup, just enough to warm my palms, not enough to brew. I carried it to the window seat and set it down beside me, leaving the cold cup untouched. There were no words to speak, no explanation required. I glanced at the shelf behind me, where the books I chose glowed in irregular order, Emerson Baldwin Morrison titles. I never felt compelled to hide. A blank journal lay beneath them, its cover still pristine. I traced the initials I'd embossed months ago, E.L. No longer Whitmore. No longer someone else's story. A text popped up on my phone that I hadn't checked in weeks. I silenced it without reading. I remembered the apex of that phone's ring, Clara's voice over speakerphone, calm and clipped. "You're making this difficult." I'd muted the call. Didn't return it. Today I didn't need to see what she had to say. The cabin smelled of cedar and one candle that had burned halfway through its life. I lit it at dawn, only to let it die before sunset. Flames demand attention. I preferred the promise of light without display. My sweater, olive wool hand-mended at the elbow, draped over the back of my chair. I slipped it on the patch of thread snagging my nail. It held the warmth of forgotten winters. I didn't mind. I moved the rocking chair closer to the bookshelf to make room for the empty seat across from me in the window nook. I didn't invite anyone, just acknowledged that space could be claimed without permission. I rose and walked to the back hall. A pair of boots sat by the door, brown leather scuffed at the toe. I slipped them on, then paused. I didn't need to leave. Something about the weight on my feet anchored me to the moment. I walked back to the window seat, boots and all. There was no plan, no errands, no reason, just the unspoken choice to exist here. I opened the old journal. On the first blank page I'd written, "Today I choose nothing." Now I turned to a fresh page. A line formed I no longer require explanation to claim my space. I closed the journal, letting that be enough. At some point, I glanced at the mantel. A small, dented tin held a single photograph, frozen under glass, me at 10, the wind whipping snow around my knees as I laughed. No one had been beside me. The image wasn't staged. I pressed a fingertip to the frame. The glass was cool, but it didn't push back. I let it sit. I didn't cover it with a blanket. I didn't bury it beneath other frames. It stayed visible, a reminder that presence isn't dependent on context. The phone buzzed again, an email notification that my server space was up for renewal. I deleted the account. The server flickered off. No archive, no backup. I brewed coffee in a French press coarse grounds precise water temperature. The plunger rose with a muted hiss. I poured into a chipped mug different from the teacup and sipped. No sugar, no cream. I let it linger. On the counter sat a sketch pad. Last night's sketches, loose lines of a child swinging from a tree branch. Not my own memory, but a dream of innocence. I folded the pad and placed it on the bookshelf alongside a thin volume of poetry I'd never rattled with notes. I ate an apple for breakfast. I didn't cut it. I bit straight through the skin and acted small but deliberate. Juice trickled down my chin. The tautness was enough to remind me I was alive. In town, I stopped at the hardware store for a package of light bulbs. I browsed the aisle, slowly touching each box, feeling the weight of options: soft white daylight, warm glow. I chose a package labeled natural. They'll match the lamp, I thought. I didn't need to justify it. The woman at the counter rang me up without looking up. Her name tag read Janelle. She bagged my bulbs in a paper sack and handed it over with a polite nod. Evening, she offered. I nodded back. No, thanks. It didn't feel necessary. Back at the cabin, I replaced the lamp's bulb. The light shifted from soft amber to bright clarity. I sat at the desk and watched the dust motes catch in the beam like tiny galaxies suspended in time. I didn't open my grandfather's letter. It remained in the bag where I'd left it. I didn't need to read it to know what he wrote, something about courage and roots. Roots grow deep. They don't always ask permission to run. I answered the final voicemail on my phone, deleted without bothering to listen. It was from the PR firm. Reminder gala is tonight. Dress code, black tie. I didn't reply. I left the voicemail indicator blinking. Instead, I placed a clean sheet of paper on the desk and wrote, "This invitation expired when I chose another address." I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fire. It flared and went out, leaving nothing but a curl of ash. Some invitations burn without heat. Scout meowed softly outside, then scratched at the door. I opened it and let him in. He didn't brush against my leg. He sat by the hearth, facing the flame, as if it were a friend. I knelt and brushed his fur, soft as a promise. He closed his eyes. No words needed to pass between us. That night, I stood in front of my reflection without flinching. The lamp's glow showed eyes that had seen too much expectation and let it fall away. I didn't search for recognition there. I only observed. I hung the sweater on a hook and wrapped my arms around myself, not out of need, but out of acknowledgement. The gesture wasn't comfort. It was a choice to hold space. I laid out a clean mug, my worn journal, and a pen. I didn't write. I only placed them ready as if to say, I am here, unannounced, unclaimed, undecorated. Silence filled the cabin like light. It settled in corners, pooled on the floor, and lifted so gently I almost missed its arrival. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just existed, no proof, no declaration, no audience required. Sometimes living quietly is the loudest statement you can make.